I am so thrilled that I am able to introduce to you my hero, mentor, and friend, David Harris, the National Executive Director of the American Jewish Committee, who has traveled here today from New York to share his insight with us. David, look around this room. You filled it today. Our largest meeting ever. And while you have David's impressive bio before you, I would like to highlight a few of his accomplishments that are not referenced in the bio. David meets frequently with world leaders to discuss issues affecting the Middle East. His efforts were credited by the Japanese government for bringing about change in Tokyo's position on its long-standing adherence to the Arab boycott against Israel and toward a more balanced approach to the larger Arab-Israeli conflict. And David is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So with that, I introduce to you David Harris.
Thank you, Beth, very much for the nice introduction. Thank you all for being here, and frankly, if I came just to congratulate Beth on becoming the new chapter president, I would say, Dayenu, it would have been enough, and I would head back to the airport because I've been your fan for a very long time. And if I were simply here to say thank you to you, Greg, and to your 3 daughters for sharing your wife with us all these years, but especially the next 2 years when you become the first husband. Dayenu, that too would have been enough. And if I had come from New York today just to say thank you to you, Sheri, for your years of leadership, which were celebrated just a few moments ago, for me again, Dayenu, it would have been enough simply for that alone. And if it were simply to say thank you to Judy and my staff colleagues, and to have the pleasure of seeing Sherry Frank, who I thought would look miserable and bereft, since I tried for years to persuade her there couldn't be life after AJC. Where are you, Sherry? I'm afraid she's becoming a poster child for what can be. So keep her in the closet, please. But Sherry, hello. And if I had come to Atlanta today only to say thank you to the chapter for giving us the gift of John Lewis earlier this month when he came and he electrified our annual meeting in Washington, having been introduced by Toby Ann Sidman, that too would warrant a Dayenu. What an extraordinary human being. What an extraordinary voice for not just civil rights, but human dignity. And for all that could and should be possible in the human spirit, that alone would be enough to warrant this trip. In fact, there are so many friends and so many connections in this room, I could probably fill the rest of my remarks with those and skip challenges in the world. But I just want to take my cue from you, Molly Parodies, who's my new hero, because I was going over to meet Beth's 3 beautiful children, and I noticed that Molly had skipped the soup and jumped right to the dessert, which is a person after my own heart. So I want to skip to the bottom line, which is the dessert, and simply say thank you to all of you, friends of AJC, members of the Consular Corps, members of the Christian community, members of ethnic communities, who enrich our lives by your participation in our work and your availability to us. And thank you to members of AJC, new and old, including Access, which has now triggered a national revolution in AJC, I hope you know. We now have Access chapters across the country. In fact, we stole your name and imprinted it on the national organization. And we now have literally thousands upon thousands of Access members from New York to San Francisco, to Miami, to Denver, across the country, all inspired by you. I think you owe yourselves a round of applause for that. And I wish I could be everywhere at once. Kathy, I couldn't see you before because of the column. But Mazel Tov, congratulations on the event, which I heard was spectacular. Linda, Steve, thank you for your role and the award that carries your parents' name and means so much to all of us at AJC. So that's the good news. If you want to avoid the bad news, leave now. You've been warned. Harris spoke earlier about our Geneva experience, something we shared. Let me come back to that for just a moment and build from there. Many of us who were familiar with Durban 1 knew what could be. Durban 1 on the eve of 9/11 had begun as what we all thought was an exercise in combating global racism, a scourge that requires permanent battle. Instead, those of us involved with Durban 1 discovered that that battle against racism had been hijacked and had been twisted very largely into an assault on the Jewish people's right to self-determination, a right accorded to most people in the world, that Israel among the community of nations had been singled out and its very right to exist questioned, unique among the community of nations, and that those of us, Jewish or non-Jewish alike, who support Israel's right to self-determination and its right to a place of security and stability and normalcy in the international community, were also assaulted, intellectually assaulted, and in some cases physically threatened, simply for the act of being identified with this exercise in Jewish sovereignty. So in preparing for Durban 2, as it was called, we were concerned. The good news is that we had less reason to be concerned this time. That for a variety of reasons, including the rare but oh so wonderful experience of seeing Jewish organizations actually cooperate. The sense of preparation, the frequent conversation with like-minded governments, some of which are represented here today. Durban 2 avoided much of the disaster of Durban 1. I'm particularly proud of the role that AJC played, and I want to highlight two aspects of it. The first, in February, the new Obama administration determined that it had to decide for itself what its approach to Durban would be. Every administration would have reserved the same right. It named a committee of 5, 3 officials from the government and 2 from the non-governmental community, to travel to Geneva, to spend a week, to meet with friend and foe alike, to meet with the UN Secretariat, and to come back with a set of recommendations for the White House. You'll be pleased to know that among the non-governmental representatives, AJC was represented. Indeed, we were the only Jewish group invited to fill one of the 2 slots. So the delegation of 5 went, it met, it came back, and it offered its recommendation to the Obama administration: stay out. Stay out of the preparatory process. If you go in, you will confer legitimacy on it, and it hasn't yet earned that legitimacy. The Obama administration, to its credit, accepted the recommendation. It stayed out of the preparatory process, and as you know, at the end, stayed out of the conference itself. I believe that the decision of the U.S. first to explore before deciding to disengage sent another message from this administration to the world that we're not going to act reflexively, rather thoughtfully. We're going to engage, we're going to consider, we're going to judge things on their merits, and then we'll decide. And I believe that that was one of the reasons, a key reason, why in Durban 1, only 2 countries abstained themselves from that shameful exercise, the U.S. and Israel. Although I want to add parenthetically, but not unimportantly, that the European Union, which chose to stay, managed to negotiate successfully to eliminate some of the worst draft language in the governmental document of Durban 1. But Durban 2 led to the withdrawal not of 2 countries, but rather of 10, remarkably. And I would like to suggest that 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, those 10 countries be etched in your memory bank. I believe that that was a watershed of sorts, and we should remember, recall, and rejoice at those 10 countries that determined this exercise was not for them. 5 EU countries, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Poland, and the Czech Republic, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, not surprisingly, Canada, which actually preceded Israel in its announcement it would not participate, and of course the United States. But there was a second piece to this as well, in addition to the 10. Harris briefly made reference to President Ahmadinejad's speech, if you will call it that, in Geneva, by the way, on Holocaust Remembrance Day, where he spoke in a hall that had been envisioned by Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin and other giants of the post-war period who wanted to try and create a structure to ensure, protect, and monitor human rights around the world. He shamed that structure. But 25 other countries would not confer legitimacy on him. And in a rare move for the UN, walkouts by democratic nations are rather unusual. 25 nations walked out in the midst of the speech, and I was in the hall and walked out with them. To their credit, every member of the European Union walked out, and some other nations as well. So there was some good news coming out of Geneva on the diplomatic front, and there was also some other good news as well. And that was that recognizing that this exercise was not going to do what it set out to do, namely to advance the struggle for human rights and against racism, it would be left to us to do it for the international community. And so AJC's UN Watch, founded by a great Georgian, born in Fitzgerald, Georgia, who practiced law in Atlanta, Georgia, who served as a lawyer for Martin Luther King, who was centrally involved in the landmark one man, one vote decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, and who became the president of AJC in 1964. I'm speaking, of course, about Morris Abram. UN Watch, his creation, which became an AJC affiliate, determined in Geneva to set an example for what the true monitoring and protection of international human rights ought to be, and maybe to show the UN what it was failing to do. And so on the Friday before Durban began, before the preparatory committee of the Durban Review Conference chaired by the diplomat from Libya, which gives you a hint, UN Watch asked for the right to testify. And as an accredited organization to the Economic and Social Council, it had the right. And AJC's Hillel Neuer came before the assembled delegates, chaired by the Libyan ambassador, and he was accompanied by an individual. They sat together at the witness table. The chair said, UN Watch, I invite you now to testify. Hillel Neuer gave the microphone to this other person who began to speak. And what did he say? He said, Madam Chair, I'm not sure if you recognize me. I am the Palestinian doctor who, together with 5 Bulgarian nurses, was imprisoned in your country, was tortured, was held incommunicado for years, until such time as I was finally released. I'm sure many of you know the story of the Bulgarian nurses and the Palestinian doctor. And if you haven't seen the clip, go to YouTube. Watch it. This cocky Libyan diplomat who thought she was in full control of the proceedings was totally flustered. She took her gavel and, not knowing what else to do, began to bang it, insistently banging it, trying to shut him up. He kept going. He kept going. The point of the story, it was AJC, the American Jewish Committee, which gave the opportunity for the Palestinian doctor, unjustly imprisoned and tortured in Libya, to be heard in Geneva, steps away from the UN Human Rights Council, which would never give him that opportunity. And on the Sunday, 2 days later, AJC's UN Watch, having reserved the Great Conference Center in the center of Geneva, held a full day of human rights hearings. We invited dissidents from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Iran, from Egypt, from around the world to come and to share their stories of imprisonment, their stories of torture, their stories of dissent, and their stories of isolation. And we were joined on the platform by Miss Canada. Miss Canada, an Iranian Canadian, has devoted her life to human rights and to stopping the death penalty, particularly when it applies to children. And where in the world today are more children on death row than anywhere else in the world? And where have more children under the age of 18 been executed than anywhere else in the world? Iran. That full day of hearings gave voice to the victims of human rights who tragically have been denied the right to have their voices heard in the only intergovernmental forum the world has created allegedly devoted to human rights, but that instead, tragically, has been diverted by countries who are among the world's great offenders of human rights, trying to ensure that their own countries do not come under scrutiny, while singling out one country for obsessive, relentless, one-sided scrutiny. And I'll let you guess which country that is. And so, on a daily basis in Geneva, it is Libya and Cuba and Saudi Arabia and Iran and others who sit in judgment of democratic Israel, while themselves ensuring that the system is rigged such that they largely avoid scrutiny of their own. That's our work, in brief. What are our challenges? Well, they were summed up in a way in the span of just a few hours yesterday. Yesterday, May 20th, 2009, as much as any day in recent memory, could summarize for me why AJC exists, why, Sheri, we need the additional 2%, and not just, and why we need to make a difference. Woke up in the morning, as many of you did, to the news that Iran had just test-fired a new ballistic missile with a range of 2,000 kilometers, that's 1,250 miles, which could reach not only every corner of the Middle East, but indeed could reach southeastern Europe, including member nations of the European Union. And not only had they test-fired this missile called the Sejil, but they had used a new fuel component, solid rather than liquid fuel, which takes them into an entirely new technological orbit in terms of what more they can do in missile development and how much more effectively they can move and even hide their missiles, because it takes a lot less time to get a solid fuel rocket going than a liquid fuel rocket. And Iran has not hidden the fact that it is working on the next generation of ballistic missiles with a range of 5,000 kilometers or 3,000 miles, which would reach practically all of Europe, not to mention substantial parts of Asia and Africa. Now, ladies and gentlemen, why is Iran developing ballistic missiles with a range of 5,000 kilometers? And here I come to a point that too often we neglect in our own advocacy. We focus, understandably and appropriately, on Iran's threat to Israel. After all, hasn't our history taught us that when leaders in power say what they're going to do, sometimes they mean it? And we would be utterly reckless to pretend they didn't. So I understand why we take at face value Ahmadinejad's dream of a world without Israel. But if we limit our advocacy to that, we're missing a key component. 5,000-kilometer range ballistic missiles are not needed to destroy the state of Israel. 2,000, thank you very much, will suffice. 5,000, though, extends the range and the impact and the influence and potentially the nuclear blackmail of Iran to a much larger part of the world. Beginning with a part of the world, let's remember, through which 40% of the world's energy supplies pass through the Straits of Hormuz. Now people ask the question, well, maybe Iran will get the bomb, but they'll never use it. They'd be crazy to use it. The Soviets didn't use it. Why would they? I don't pretend to know whether Iran would ever use a nuclear bomb. I don't want to find out. I also know something else. I know something else from the example of North Korea and from a study of the Cold War. You don't have to use a nuclear bomb to exert influence. It's enough to have the capacity to make a nuclear bomb, much less to own a fully packaged nuclear bomb with the means to deliver it, to be able to flex your muscles. Look at the international community today. We have the Consul General of Japan. I'm sure that if he were standing here right now, he could tell you a great deal about what it means to have a neighboring country, North Korea, which we believe has a nuclear bomb, which has the ballistic missile technology, because Iran can be thankful to North Korea for much of that technology, and which is sufficiently unpredictable and irrational, an actor, North Korea that is, that you can never be certain what it will or will not do? Can anyone assure us that this eschatological belief in the end of days, driven by the arrival of the hidden or 12th Imam, the Mahdi, which drives the philosophy of Ahmadinejad and his confrere, will not lead Iran to one day either use weapons or outsource weapons, dirty bombs, to whom? Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Syria, or to share technology to bring it closer to Atlanta, Georgia, with Ahmadinejad's good friend in the Western Hemisphere, Hugo Chavez? How many of us fully appreciate the attempt by Iran, primarily using Caracas as a bridgehead, to penetrate the Western Hemisphere and to now use this group of nations, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela, perhaps others, in an effort to further penetrate into our own hemisphere? Let me share with you one disturbing aspect of this, again to bring it home and to tie it to the second point of yesterday, which you also can anticipate. Every week, there is a flight that originates in Tehran, that stops in Damascus, and that arrives in Caracas. Every week. No visas are required, and we are told that the flight arriving in Caracas disembarks at a separate hangar. Who's on those flights? Legitimate businessmen? Tourists? Who knows? Those who know Venezuela know that it's rather simple to get a passport. It's no big secret. For money or for ideology, the passport office in Venezuela is quite sympathetic to Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas. So, someone comes from Damascus, someone comes from Tehran, someone arrives in Caracas, having come as Yusuf Ali, and leaving with a passport named Mario Sanchez. And before long, he's in Colombia with FARC. Before long, he's elsewhere in the hemisphere. Or before long, he's making his way from Guatemala to Mexico to the coyotes who will bring him across to the United States. This is not the stuff of science fiction. This is the stuff that intelligence agencies know today. Today. This Iran challenge is not an Israel challenge alone, and we shouldn't make it one. This is a challenge to the chokehold on the world's energy supplies, to the potential for nuclear brinkmanship and blackmail in a vast arc from Europe to Asia to large parts of Africa, and yes, even to the Western Hemisphere. And the Iran nuclear question poses, I believe, together with Afghanistan and Pakistan, the single greatest challenge, not just to the United States, but to all nations, including those represented here today, who are concerned about peace and stability and security around the world. And that's the way I believe these issues need to be framed and pursued. And today, not tomorrow, we don't have the luxury of a mañana mentality. Every day counts. And that brings me to the other bookend of yesterday, May 20th. I was coming home last night from an AJC event in New York, a wonderful event in which we honored the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue, Peter Rubenstein. And I was so moved and touched and inspired by the keynote speaker, who was Michael J. Fox. Michael J. Fox, who came not just as an actor and an author, but as one whose body has been ravaged by Parkinson's disease, and who now is largely unable to control the movement of his body. But he was there because his family are members of Central Synagogue in New York. His children either have been or will be bar and bar mitzvahed, go to the Hebrew school there, and he says he never thought growing up as a Christian kid in Canada that he would refer to his rabbi as his rabbi. But he does, and he did, and it was very powerful, and I was in that zone going home last night thinking about all this when the news hit. Breaking alert, New York Times. Breaking news, Washington Post on the BlackBerry. God, I wish they didn't invent these things. There are no more zones. There was 4 people arrested by the FBI and the New York Police Department in a joint operation, having prevented a planned attack on a Jewish community center and a synagogue in Riverdale, New York, that's in the Bronx section of New York, and having planned a Stinger missile attack on planes leaving from Newburgh, New York, about an hour and a half north of the city. God bless the FBI and the New York Police Department for having, from beginning to end, skillfully handled this and prevented it. But another reminder, if one is needed, of the threats, the real threats, not the imagined, contrived threats that we're sometimes accused of manufacturing, the real threats that exist to our nation and to like-minded nations. And if you want to bring it closer to home, the synagogue is the home of Steve Boehm. Steve Boehm, of course, is one of our senior staff people. Many of you know Steve very well. One was from Afghanistan originally, and here's the other important point. Converts to Islam from the American prison system. Now, I don't want to say we told you so, but we told you so. We met with Louis Freeh when he was the FBI director during the Clinton days. I was present. And AJC said to the FBI then, and said it again, watch the American prison system. Watch who you're bringing in under the guise of chaplains. Yehudi Barsky on the AJC staff wrote a piece in the Forward 4 years ago specifically on the question of the American prison system and the attempt to convert and radicalize inmates, not just to Islam as in the Sufi form of ecumenical, spiritual, mystical Islam, but in radical Islam, meaning us against the world. And by the way, this is a problem not unique to the United States. It's a problem that exists, if I am correct, Consul General, in the UK. This is a problem that I know exists in France because we've had the same discussions with the French Ministry of the Interior and the Élysée Palace. This is a widespread problem. But again, another sobering reminder of the threats that are real and that affect all of us. It doesn't matter whether we pray in that synagogue in Riverdale or not. It could be any of us. And it doesn't even matter if we're Jewish. It was an assault on a house of worship. It could have been anyone's house of worship. And just as the Gaze Hill Baptist Church here in Georgia years ago was the target of a hate crime that destroyed the church, it was AJC that went to Millen, Georgia, and that began to help rebuild the Gaze Hill Baptist Church, because we understood then, as others must understand now, that an assault on a house of worship that brings people together for the simple act of faith and community is an assault on human dignity, every bit as much as it's an assault on any particular community, be it Baptists or Catholics or Greek Orthodox, or for that matter, Muslims or Jews. And so my final point to us is we look around the world and see both the blessings and the threats, is that we need each other. The Atlanta chapter, the national office, the international offices. We need each other. The United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Taiwan, Israel, and the other countries represented here. We need each other, Jews and Gentiles. We need each other to form coalitions of conscience, coalitions of principle that stand for the best of human values, that stand for true human rights and their protection, that stand for true religious, not just tolerance, but respect for one another, that stand for true peaceful conflict resolution, that stand tall and strong and determined and courageous together, because the threats are real. And if we don't stand together to face them together, then our enemies will be the beneficiaries. We have faced enemies before, successfully, if at great cost. It was a few weeks ago, I was visiting my youngest son, Josh, who's a graduate student at Cambridge University. And we took a trip to the cemetery in Mattingly, just a mile or two outside of Cambridge. It is the only American military cemetery in the UK. There, I can't say is buried, but there are the names of Joseph Kennedy Jr., Glenn Miller, who were lost. Their bodies were never found during the Second World War. Mattingly was another reminder for me, if reminders are needed, that we faced common enemies before. We've stood together, like-minded nations and peoples. Each is a unique situation, but the bottom line is that together we will prevail. Our platform in this room to engage that world is AJC. None of us can do it alone. None of us can meet the governments we need to meet with, can make the statements we need to make in Geneva. None of us can do it alone. AJC gives us the platform to engage a world, both to fulfill the dreams and aspirations of the prophetic vision of the Jewish people, but also to stand firm against those who would destroy human value and human dignity. Thank you for all that you do. Let's stand together, and we shall prevail.